Let me start with a number because this week the numbers stopped making sense. In 2026, the biggest technology companies on Earth are on track to spend somewhere around $725 billion building artificial intelligence infrastructure. Not on research, not on salaries, on concrete, copper, silicon, and power. Amazon alone is pointed at roughly $200 billion. Google, Microsoft, and Meta each carry 9, 10. And this week, two of those companies did something that tells you more than the headline CAPEX figure ever could. I want to walk through what actually happened, and then I want to tell you why almost everyone is reading it wrong. Here is what happened. On July 2nd, Microsoft stood up something it is calling the Microsoft Frontier Company. $2.5 billion and 6,000 engineers described as forward deployed, 2 days earlier. Meanwhile, SoftBank is spinning up a vehicle called SB Neo to run a United States neocloud business, layering yet another financier onto a stack that already includes the $500 billion Stargate project with OpenAI and Oracle. So in the span of about 72 hours, three of the most capitalized entities in the world all moved in the same direction at once. When that happens, it is worth asking what they can see that the market narrative cannot. Open any finance page and you will find the same argument on repeat. The spending is enormous, the revenue is lagging, therefore this is 2000 all over again, therefore it pops. I understand the reflex. When capital rushes in to build the thing before anyone has proven demand for the thing, your instinct should be skepticism. That is a healthy instinct and I share it. But I think the bubble framing is lazy, and I want to be precise about why. A bubble in the strict sense is a price detached from underlying value, sustained by the belief that someone else will pay more later. TulipBulbsPets.com. The thing about a classic bubble is that the asset does not do anything. Its only value is the next buyer. That is not what is happening here. A data center full of accelerators is not a tulip. It produces a real, measurable, saleable output, which is compute. The question is not whether the asset is worthless. The question is a much more specific and much more uncomfortable engineering question. Can they generate enough revenue from that compute before the hardware inside those buildings loses most of its value? That is not a bubble question. That is a depreciation question, and it is the one nobody wants to say out loud. So let me say it out loud because this is where the engineering actually matters. When one of these companies buys a fleet of the latest accelerators, it puts them on the balance sheet and depreciates them over some assumed useful life. A few years ago, the industry quietly stretched those schedules from 3 years to 5, and in some cases 6. On paper, that makes the economics look healthier because you spread the cost over more quarters, but the physics does not care about your accounting. The next generation arrives, delivers dramatically more performance per watt, and suddenly your 5-year asset is competing against something twice as efficient in year 2. The customer does not want to rent last year's silicon at last year's price, so you either cut the price, which crushes your margin, or you let it sit idle, which is worse. The depreciation schedule is a promise about the future. The refresh cycle is a threat to that promise. Take a single accelerator that costs tens of thousands of dollars up front. To simply break even over a 5-year schedule, it has to earn a few dollars an hour, every hour, for 5 years straight at high utilization, minus power and cooling and the cut the landlord takes. Now ask how many of these racks are actually running that hot, that continuously, on paying workloads rather than free trials and internal experiments. Nobody publishes that utilization number cleanly, and the reason nobody publishes it is that it is the single figure that would settle this entire debate. Now hold that thought and go back to what Microsoft and Amazon actually did this week, because this is the part I find genuinely revealing. They did not just announce more square footage, they announced forward deployed engineers. Think about what that phrase means. Forward deployed is consulting language. It means you are sending your own people into the customer's building to make the thing actually work, to wire the models into real workflows to produce an outcome. You do not staff up thousands of forward deployed engineers when your product is selling itself. You do that when raw capacity is not converting into revenue fast enough on its own, and you have realized you have to go drag the value out by hand. That is not the move of a company drunk on hype. That is the move of a company that has looked at the gap between how much compute it is building and how much of it is actually being monetized and has decided to close that gap with labor. It is, if you read it honestly, a quiet admission. Selling the shovels was supposed to be enough. It is turning out that they also have to come dig. There's a second constraint that the bubble talk completely ignores, and it is the one I would watch most closely over the next 18 months. Power. You cannot run $700 billion of compute on good intentions. These facilities need gigawatts, and the grid in most of the places these companies want to build is not ready for it. Interconnection queues are measured in years. Transformers and turbines are backordered. In several regions, the binding constraint on AI is no longer chips at all. It is whether the local utility can deliver the electricity. This is the least glamorous number in the entire story, and it may be the most important, because you can finance a data center in a weekend, and you cannot finance a substation into existence. The companies that locked up power and land early have a moat that no amount of capital can quickly reproduce. The ones that assumed power would just be there are going to discover that concrete is the easy part. Now let me get to the part of this that actually keeps me up. Follow the money in a circle. A chip maker takes a strategic stake in a model lab. That model lab signs a massive multi-year commitment to a cloud provider. That cloud provider turns around and buys tens of billions of dollars of chips from the same chip maker. Round and round, each leg of that loop gets announced as a separate headline with its own giant number, and the market adds them all up as if they were independent demand. They are not independent. A lot of this is the same capital being counted 2 and 3 times as it circulates through the ecosystem. That does not make the technology fake, but it does mean the aggregate spending figure, the 700 billion everyone quotes, is softer than it looks because a meaningful chunk of the demand propping up one company's revenue is another company's capex, financed in part by a third company's investment. When the underlying end demand from actual paying customers finally has to carry that structure on its own, we will find out how much of it was real orders and how much was vendors financing their own order book. That is the reckoning I would circle on the calendar. So who actually survives this? Not everyone building today, and that is the healthy part. This is where I part ways with both the cheerleaders and the doomsayers. The cheerleaders think the spending proves the future. The doomsayers think the spending proves a crash. It does not do that either. What the spending proves is that these companies believe demand is coming and are willing to pre-build for it. Some of them are right. The ones that will come through this are the ones who can convert compute into recurring, sticky, high-margin revenue faster than the hardware depreciates. That means owning the customer relationship, not just the rack. It means the forward-deployed model actually working. The ones who bought a mountain of accelerators on a 6-year schedule with no clear path to monetize them in 2 are the ones who will be quietly writing down assets in 2027 and calling it a strategic realignment. And let me push on my own argument for a second, because a good skeptic turns the knife on himself too. The strongest case against me is that at sufficient scale, being early is its own moat. If demand really does arrive the way these companies are betting, then the ones who overbuilt will look like geniuses, and the depreciation worry will read like a rounding error against a decade of dominance. That is a real possibility, and I am not going to pretend it away. History does reward the ones who build capacity ahead of a genuine wave. The railroads overbuilt too, and a lot of them went bankrupt, and yet the rails they laid ran trains for a century. Overbuilding and bubble are not the same thing, and the survivors of the first can be spectacular. But here is where I land. This is not a bubble in the way the word is being thrown around, and calling it one is going to make people prepare for the wrong event. Nobody is going to wake up to a single dramatic pop. What is coming is slower and more surgical. It is a margin squeeze, driven by a depreciation clock that is running faster than the accounting admits, gated by a power supply that cannot scale on a spreadsheet's timeline, and inflated by financing that circles back on itself. The tell is not the size of the checks. The tell is that the companies writing them just sent thousands of their own engineers into the field to manually pull revenue out of the capacity they already built. That is not confidence. That is a hedge. My verdict is this: the AI infrastructure boom is real, the compute is real, and the demand is probably real too. But the timing risk is enormous, and it is concentrated in exactly the players the market treats as safest. Do not ask whether the bubble pops. Ask who can turn a GPU into a paying customer before the chip becomes a paperweight. That question, not the capex headline, is the one that decides who is standing in 2028. If that reframing was useful, subscribe, because I take one overhyped story every day and run the actual engineering math on it. No press releases, no hype. I will see you in the next one.